Lisa Pahamas and Clarence Yoldersma, who respectively are, Lisa is a sociologist of education with particular interests in forms of human oppression and the development of resilience in the face of this. Clarence is a philosopher of education with diverse interests, including neuroscience and education, the work of Emmanuel Levinas on, in particular in respect of teaching and learning, and many other interesting topics. They are tonight speaking to a paper that's just being published in the Journal of Philosophy of Education. It's out online now already. And this paper is in fact something we invited them to do because of a collection of papers we're putting together related to the pulling down of monuments for obvious reasons. So we're delighted to have their paper and one by Penny Enslin in the present issue of the journal as forerunners of a number of papers that will be published in the early months next year. Tonight, Lisa and Clarence are going to speak to the title, What Might Sustain the Activism of the Moment, Dismantling White Supremacy, One Monument at a Time. Welcome, Lisa and Clarence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Clarence and I are so happy that you're here. I was going to say this afternoon, it's this afternoon for us, but this evening for all of you. And we look forward to engaging in discussion about our paper throughout our talk this evening. So let's go ahead and begin. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Rekia Boyd, Michael Brown, Miriam Carey, Alexia Christian, Terrence Crutcher, Michelle Cusseau, Chantel Davis, Eric Gardner, Corinne Gaines, Pearlie Golden, Oscar Grant, Freddie Gray, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Aina Stanley Jones, Betty Jones, Radell Jones, India Kager, Trayvon Martin, Natasha McKenna, Laquan McDonald, Kayla Moore, Tamir Rice, Pamela Turner, and Dominique White. A poem. Listen, kids who die, maybe now there will be no monument for you, except in our hearts. But the day will come. That's Langston Hughes, Kids Who Die. We suggest that the day has come, and the day is now. And we want to begin by acknowledging the personhood of those killed, recognizing the urgency of now in this historical moment, and the importance of remembrance is the context of our talk today. Some additional context about our paper. As Paul pointed out, one of us is a philosopher and the other a sociologist, which caused some tension in how we wanted to go about writing this paper. And we asked ourselves, how philosophical do we want to be at a historical moment of political divisiveness, economic insecurity, Black people being killed, police brutality, the COVID-19 pandemic, and cruel immigration policies? We wrestled to find an academic footing during a time that calls for joining protesters on the street. When our grandchildren ask what we did during the Black Lives Matter movement, we want to be able to tell them that we were among the activists demanding change. This is a moment that calls for action rather than writing about action. And within this context, we have tried to shape the article so that the act of reading is a form itself of resistance. The intersubjectivity between reader and article text, we hope, can animate the analysis of white supremacy that pushes people outside of their theoretical comfort zones. We also want to acknowledge as we begin today, the limitations of our paper, for it is partial like everything else. We want to acknowledge at the outset that we do not complicate the concept of race with the lens of intersectionality, yet race is not a monolith. We do not offer an in-depth critique of how the realities of intersecting identities mirror the social organization of power relations in society. We have not offered an analysis from a decolonial theoretical perspective. And finally, we have largely omitted the rich history of social movement building. What we have done, however, is begun a conversation with a rich theoretical lens. We invite the use of this article as a possible entree into larger, multi-dynamic conversations. Rather than considering this article a closed text, we hope its textual borders function as porous touch points with other texts, for the conversation around issues raised in anti-racist critical public pedagogies is extensive and requires a multitude of perspectives that extend beyond the scope of any single text. Our focused goal is to extend a critical analysis of the Confederate monument debate in order to challenge the racialization of hegemonic and oppressive power relations and to consider some reimaginings for transformational ways of living together. The partiality of this analysis accentuates the paces and spaces for continued conversation. We also want to acknowledge that the history of today's talk is one of state-sanctioned white-on-black killing. In the United States, racism is deeply entrenched in systems of policing and judicial oversight. And finally, our theoretical perspective this evening is that of Black radical feminist literature. Drawing on the knowledge, the expertise, and the wisdom that is the richness of Black radical feminist literature and scholars of color, we examine grand narratives and counter narratives. Grand narratives are those that uphold the status quo. These are the colonial accounts. These are the stories told by the Confederate monuments. Whereas the counter narratives are the narratives told from the margins that interrupt power inequities. And these are the narratives of the protests. I'm going to share my screen at this point.
All right, I'll continue. And before we go further, we'd also like to acknowledge a few more things. So we'd like to acknowledge that as authors, our viewing is shaped. Our viewing of the images we share, the storytelling is shaped by our position, by our social location, by our intersection of our identities. And therefore, we'd acknowledge that each of us here are viewing and narrating from our own positionality. And we invite each of us to bring those diverse perspectives to today's conversation. And we'd also acknowledge in that context that our social location, each of us might have a different relationship to the images and the discussion here. So for some, the discussion might be tightly intertwined with actual lived experiences of racism, and it's not abstract. It can trigger trauma. Whereas for others of us, the discussion is, well, maybe a little more academic, that there's a space between the lived experiences and the reality of racism. We'd also like to acknowledge that both of us authors are white, and we recognize that our article's perspective is necessarily influenced by our whiteness. Because of that, we've engaged, as Lisa said, directly with the perspectives and ideas of the scholars of color, particularly the ideas of Black radical feminism. So that said, let's turn to our definition of monuments. We take this from Verity Platt. She says monuments are ideological powerhouses, physical objects that compress whole systems of authority into bodies of bronze and marble. So we use this definition to show that monuments embed the grand narrative that Lisa mentioned. Now, as she said, we use the idea of grand narrative as something that tells a mainstream story, that perpetuates the status quo and has a hegemonic storyline. And we'd like to acknowledge that's somewhat different than Lyotard's idea of grand narrative. He used it as a meta discourse or a philosophy of history, and we're not really doing a philosophy of history as such. So the collage you see here is a collage of Confederate monuments which valorize defenders of slavery. So many of these have a horse and rider. Now, classically, a mounted rider is a great man of history, a hero. And the horses they ride are often muscular, spirited. They embody raw power, the raw power of the state. The high plinth adds monumentality to the monument. In other words, it raises up the statue to increase its power. And they're located in prominent public places. And so the valorizing of the statues happens publicly, officially. So in telling the grand narrative, these monuments manifest opulence. They're meant to impress. They express power, physical power, but also state power. They embody ideology, in particular white supremacy. So they concretize the specter of white supremacy that looms daily over especially Black citizens. So these monuments can be seen as ideological powerhouses. They can be seen as physical objects compressing whole systems of authority into the bronze and into the marble. So the ideological powerhouses gain their power partly or largely because of their location in public spaces. They're located, for example, in front of government institutions, courthouses, legislative assemblies, town halls. They're in public parks, for example, veterans commemorations. They're in front of educational institutions, elementary and high schools, universities. And everywhere where they are, the interaction between viewer and monument reinforces white superiority, valorizes the violence of whiteness. And it is in telling the grand narrative of Western colonization that monuments embody these systems of authority. For example, here you see a monument celebrating Spanish conquistadors conquering the southwest of the United States. This is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This monument valorizes the grand narrative of Europe colonizing what they called the New World. So we'd like to tell you two quick stories. We're going to tell them in picture form. The first one we're calling the story of re-envisioning. The second is the story of reimagining. So the first one is Robert E. Lee. This is Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, on a street called Monument Avenue. Lee was a general. He was commander of the Confederate States Army during the American Civil War, which was a war about the institution of slavery, and the Confederate States Army was defending that institution. And the Civil War ended in 1863. So this monument is part of the grand narrative of colonization as concretized in the US South, the valorizing of plantation society and its slave-based economy. And as such, it enshrines a set of values, the values of the Confederacy. So Lee, you see here, is a mounted rider. That makes him a great man of history, a hero of the Civil War. The high plinth gives power to the ideology of white supremacy, and the horse embodies the state power enforcing that white supremacy. And this is valorized in a very public space, namely Monument Avenue, one end, and this statue is one end of a street that has a number of Confederate statues and monuments. He's been here for 125 years. So white supremacy has been reinscribed through its continuous presence. The remembrance and the legitimation and the reinscription of ideology is what makes this monument an ideological powerhouse. So fast forward to the summer of 2020 that's just happened. So consider what you see here. What is happening to the grand narrative and the ideological powerhouse that is Lee's monument? You see here a large crowd approaching it without reverence. They're occupying its public space. And as a result, they're beginning to shift the power of the monument to the people and beginning to shift the grand narrative through a counter narrative. Here's the protest, or more accurately, the uprising closer up. You see a defanging of the monument's power through paint, through signs, and through symbols. So the creative destruction of the monument is really a creative destruction of the ideological power. A slightly closer look of the same monument. What we see here is irreverence to the plinth's uplifting power. By standing on the plinth, delegitimizes its monumentality. There's a creative desecrating of the purity of the white collar, which pierces its opulence and counters its power. But it's not merely just protest against something. Here you see an illumination of that same plinth, which is a projection of George Floyd's photograph. There's a reclaiming of the public space here, a reauthoring of the stories. In other words, a shifting of who should be valorized and who should be lifted up. So there's a re-envisioning through re-imaging. Black Lives Matter. And on that same plinth also was illuminated Breonna Taylor's image. So this again shifts who should be memorialized in this public space. Re-envisioning through re-imaging. Say her name. So this is the first story. There's a juxtaposition here that you see, juxtaposing the Confederate ideological powerhouse with the monument, that same monument, re-envisioned. So a change in who has the power in this story, a change in the authorship of the story, a change in who tells the story, but also what is told. So a story of re-envisioning, a counter-narrative brought into the public view. The second story, again in picture form, the story of Edward Colston in Bristol, in England. So this is a story of reimagining, similar storyline, same grand narrative of colonization, but different context, United Kingdom rather than the United States. So here you see Edward Colston in a public space in a harbour city of Bristol, England. Now, Colston headed what was called the Royal African Company, which is a trading company between England and Africa and the Caribbean, a triangle. And he traded in all three legs, and on one leg he was a slave trader. And with his money, he became a philanthropist and contributed to Bristol's richness as a city. So there's Colston Hall and Colston Tower and Colston Avenue. There's a window in the Bristol Cathedral, the Catholic cathedral, and there's a window in St. Mary Redcliffe, the Anglican church dedicated to Colston. Now, in this monument, you don't see obvious state power here, compared to, say, the military man like Lee in the previous story, but rather you see an exemplary citizen of the city. So this monument memorializes his contributions to the city. It valorizes his life as a whole. It inscribes his life as exemplary for the public. And if you notice on the plinth, there's a plaque. Take a close-up of the plaque. It's a little hard to read. I'll read it with you. It says, "Erected by the citizens of Bristol as a memorial of one of the most virtuous and wise sons of their city, 1895. So it says Bristol valorizes him, but also valorizes the grand narrative of colonization and slavery, in particular slave trading. And this statue has been in this public place, and you can do the math, 125 years. It embodies the ideology and power of the grand narrative concentrated in this public space through this monument for that length of time. Fast forward to the uprising of this summer. Consider what you see here. You see a ring of bodies in a prone position at the foot of the plinth. But they're not just arranged any old way. They're arranged the way captured African people were positioned in the hold of the ships, and the Royal African Company ships, perhaps, during the middle passage from Africa to the Caribbean. So this protest is an indicting commentary on Colston as a virtuous citizen and on Bristol valorizing him. So this is a counter-narrative coming into public view. Here you see Black Lives Matter protesters with ropes lowering Colston into the harbor. So they're engaging in whole body creative removal and destruction of the statue, throwing Colston's statue into the harbor, drowning him, if you will. There's a power shift, there's a perspective shift, there's an ideology shift. And remember, we define monuments as ideological powerhouses, part of a grand narrative. If that's true, then the protesters literally holding the rope are holding the rope of the story. They're actively rewriting the story of this slave trader, ending his life differently, humiliating. So you see here, shift of power, shift of the story, protesting who should tell it, protesting what the storyline should be, protesting what the city should be memorializing. The young woman holding this cardboard sign is a plaque replacement. The plaque says, this plaque, or her cardboard plaque says, this plaque is dedicated to the slaves that were taken from their homes. So consider what she's doing. This is more than just a protest. She's reimagining. She's retelling the story. She's telling a counter narrative. She's moving it into the center, and she's decentering the grand narrative. So this shifts. Who is telling the story? It shifts. Who is considered virtuous? It shifts. Who is valorized? Who is memorialized in public? Now, while they were drowning Colston in the harbor, right, the plinth is empty. So Jen Reed, Black Lives Matter protester, climbs on top of this empty plinth, a plinth where Colston stood for 125 years. She's not just protesting, she's raising her hand, her arms, she's looking up. She's creatively performing a different story. She's suggesting that this is the story we all need to know, telling a counter narrative about who actually are the virtuous citizens of the city. She's reimagining, in other words, how we can live together in a new way. An artist, sculptor Mark Quinn, collaborated with Jen Reed to create a statue and erected it on a plinth guerrilla style. They called it Surge of Power. No longer just a protester standing temporarily on top of the plinth, but a permanent statue. Not just a moment of protest, but wanting something permanent, inscribing something, a different story in these public spaces more permanently. So it's reimagining a different story being told by a new statue, the future of the world flowing through her, someone called this. A collective narrative of living together differently. So this is the recap of story 2, right? You see a juxtaposition, and that juxtaposition shows a shift of authorship, a shift of power, a shift of who's narrating, a shift in which stories being told, and all are pushing back against white supremacy and colonization. So it's a reimagining of living together in new ways. So in this article, we use the lens of anti-racist critical public pedagogy. And we use it as something that we think can sustain the activism of this moment. And by anti-racist critical public pedagogy, we want to draw attention to relations of power that occur in public spaces. It invites self-reflection on our everyday practices. It helps us understand that those practices are embedded in historically situated relationships. And anti-racist critical public pedagogy, we're suggesting, has 3 elements: culture of praxis, racial honesty, radical imagination, and radical love. I'll talk about culture of praxis, and then Lisa will talk about the other 2. So we draw our idea of culture of praxis from philosopher Christa Dodson, and she developed it in discussion with Audre Lorde's idea that philosophy has limits. So Dodson wants philosophy's culture to change from a culture of justification to a culture of praxis. And by that she means valuing multiple forms of disciplinary validation, multiple canons, valuing participation, one that intertwines reflection and action. She says it values doing philosophy aimed at living issues in present context, philosophy for livable options. Now we're connecting culture of praxis to this moment, both to the uprisings and to our own writing of this article. For us, it means a commitment to ongoing questioning and a willingness to take action even as we reflect, to create new spaces for working together, to think towards transformational ways of living together. Alice Walker's poem, Renaissance, begins by saying, I must love the questions themselves. And this means, according to Grace Lee Boggs, whether you win or lose, each struggle brings forth new contradictions, new and more challenging questions. So loving the questions is central to our idea of culture of praxis. Loving the questions means committing to ongoing social critique, to authentic curiosity, to brave conversations. And such questioning leads to vision and action, namely asking new questions for thinking about acting, for thinking and acting together, embracing the contradictions and not getting stuck in old ideas as much as possible. So there's a circulation of reflection and action in the current Black Lives Matter uprising. Each encounter with a Confederate statue facilitates a particular pedagogical exchange about history and the present. Patricia Hill Collins argues, oppression is not merely understood in the mind, it is felt in the body. The embodied interactions between statue and viewer circulate white supremacy conceptions and values. Therefore, the uprising's dismantling of a monument is not symbolically dismantling an ideology. It is dismantling, bit by physical bit, anti-Black racism and the hierarchical racial ordering. So it's more than rioting against the status quo. It is boldly revolutionary. It is re-envisioning how societies can be reorganized and that the way that their institutions can better attend to the needs of all the people.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce the second element that we identify for anti-racist critical public pedagogy, and that is of racial honesty. And by racial honesty, we mean honesty about the impacts of racism and white supremacy across cultural relationships. Angela Davis once said, oftentimes in history, a particular set of conditions will arise, a particular conjuncture, and it reveals the opportunity to accomplish something. So we argue that this is a historical moment, is a particular conjuncture, and that we have an opportunity to do something. Of racial honesty, we identify three aspects. The first is there's no such thing as neutrality, right? The absences and the silences speak and communicate just as much as the words and actions do. You're necessarily taking a political stand in the Confederate Monument debate. Racial honesty also draws our attention to and corrects historical falsehoods, and it attends to hearing and acknowledging the counter narratives of African American resistance. So what we have here is an overview of the geographical distribution of the Confederate monuments. And so recalling the definition of monuments about being systems of authority, and you take a look of how much authority, how much power is concentrated in the southeast part of the United States, which is of course where the Confederacy was. So in the antebellum South, in the southeast part of the United States, here we have the slave economy, cotton plantations, and once again, the Confederacy. Another visual depiction here is when we're taking a look at when the monuments were built, and you can see two spikes of when monuments were erected. The first one is in the first decade of the 1900s, and this is when we had the Jim Crow laws, which were laws after the Civil War that legalized racial segregation. And I just want you to notice that the blue dots represent monuments that were built on courthouse grounds. And the second spike to the right, which is a little bit smaller, but a spike nonetheless, is in the 1960s, which is the civil rights era. So we just want to, as we're thinking about the counter narratives and the protests around these monuments, to have some historical perspective of when Jim Crow laws changed, for example, but the monuments stayed, right? That the long-lasting impact that happened as a pushback during times of more racial equity. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen now. And I invite you to turn your cameras on if you want. We're going to actually share a part of our paper at this point, and then we'll go back to having some discussion. So I want us to think about a protest on the ground. At a recent protest of a Confederate statue in Allendale, Michigan, one of the protesters gave a speech that dispelled the idea that Confederate monuments are to be understood in symbolic terms. Citing a June 2020 New York Times op-ed piece, the speech began, "There was a piece in the newspaper by Carolyn Randall Williams entitled, 'Want a Confederate Monument? My body is a Confederate monument.' And it begins like this. The Black people I come from were owned and raped by the white people I come from. Who dares to tell me to celebrate them? I have rape-colored skin. My light brown blackness is a living testament to the rules, the practices, the causes of the Old South. If there are those who want to remember the legacy of the Confederacy, if they want monuments, well then, my body is a monument. My skin is a monument." She is asking us to think about how history does not just live in the past. It is part of our present moment. She is asking us to understand that history is an account of the past whose story lives and breathes today. She is asking us to grapple with the ways that the history of slavery and racism continues to show up in people's daily lives today. Let's stop the speech for a moment. Perspective matters. If one's family can be traced back to enslaved people, a Confederate monument will speak its history of violence and exploitation in more intimate terms than for a person whose family can be traced back to slave owners. The affective impact of anti-Black white supremacy statues is racialized in this way. The third element of anti-racist critical public pedagogy that we want to talk about is radical imagination and radical love. The key idea that we discuss in this section of the paper is that the debate about what should be done with the statues, we argue, is a love struggle, a reimagining of our collective future through concrete action. So let's think about some of these words. Imagination is a re-envisioning with new reference points of meaning. Love is translating that imagination into action. And action is a shift in power relations. As Angela Davis has consistently said in her justice work, radical simply means grasping things at their root. We posit that yet another dimension of anti-racist critical public pedagogy involves grasping imagination and love at their root by daring to imagine that which seems impossible and committing to loving fiercely. Taking seriously the role of imagination and love in societal transformation builds on a long history of consciousness raising and anti-racism living and work. It is a framework that understands both imagination and love in revolutionary terms and grounds its principles in ending, this is a quote, "the occupation of our bodies and souls by the agents of a larger American culture that demonstrates daily how we, people of color, don't matter." That's Con Cullors and Bendel. Protests, such as those surrounding Confederate monuments, are rebellions that break the threads that hold white supremacy systems together, whereas radical imagination and love characterize revolution, which is about taking responsibility for reorganizing society. Dismantling without a vision for how we, people and living organisms, can live together differently is insufficient for effecting sustainable change. With this responsibility of imagining in mind, we accept the role that radical imagination and love play in connecting day-to-day struggles with a much larger vision of what a different world could look like. Anti-racist critical public pedagogy involves radically imagining a different future. This entails being steadfast about envisioning transformational social change. It means being bold about how we reimagine a different future, taking shape and visionary about what this future looks like. Importantly, in recognizing societal problems rooted in systems of power, a vision for anti-racist public pedagogies is grounded in a commitment for structural change that includes consideration of who gets to decide what this future should look like. Bringing that vision into play through present action, a radical imagination, is also as much about possible pasts as it is about possible futures. It challenges and reconceptualizes social organization, both in how its histories get told and its futures get conceived, to repair historical injustices. A radical imagination calls for equity with the collective consciousness that centers identities marginalized by hegemonic relationships of power. In the Confederate monument debate, this has manifested in negotiations of what should happen to these statues once removed, both in terms of where the statues should get placed instead, and with regard to what should replace the statues on the plinths. Some have advocated for leaving the monuments in place and adding context so that the monument can be understood in historical terms. The idea of contextualization, though, assumes that the architecture and the opulence of the monument itself are not the problem, that additional words or the right words can remediate the monument's aesthetic power and message. Locating this perspective in actual Confederate monument protests that both resists, rebels, and imagines, which is material for revolution, we return to the speech given in Allendale, Michigan. Our protest is possible because people before us struggled to make it possible. These are not new arguments. This is not a new fight. Deciding how to interpret our history is not a new dilemma. And yet, to quote longtime activist and author Angela Davis, this is an extraordinary moment. It is a pivotal moment, a moment of possibility. But let's be clear. It does not mean that we are necessarily offered a new future. What we are offered, rather, is the possibility of reimagining the future, end quote. So how do we reimagine a different future? What might this future look like? And who gets to decide about this future? What if our protests, like that of the many anti-racism rallying cries across the world right now, is part of making this future? This political moment is not just about protesting what is. It is about creating what we want instead. This makes what we do today of tremendous significance. Let's think together about how our actions today both re-examine our racist past and invest in an equitable future. Not a more equitable future, but a truly equitable future. It is 2020, and people of color are still dying. The urgency of this moment calls for immediate and bold interruptions of racism, and it calls for creating interruptions which simultaneously resist what is and envision how to live together instead. It is often said that we are the change we want to see in this world. And longtime Black Power activist Grace Lee Boggs argued that we are the leaders we have been looking for. Our actions at this protest are actions that do more than speak about the violence of racism. Our protest demands a different future. I want to share the words of a Mayan poem by Luis Valdez in Lakesh, "You are my other me." You are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. Protesting the racism of this statue is an expression of how you are my other me. I am the other you. We are responsible for each other. Holding ourselves accountable for each other today means accepting the responsibility of shaping a different tomorrow. And it means that we are willing to understand how a Black woman's skin is a Confederate monument. It means, as Angela Davis says, that we no longer accept the things we cannot change. Rather, we change the things we cannot accept. End of speech. Although change is possible, how this change happens depends upon perspective. Some view social change as something that happens incrementally from within systems. A radical imagination, by contrast, envisions social change as steep, comprehensive, and systemic, changing the practices and institutions themselves. The time is now for radically reimagining how to change the things that cannot be accepted. With regard to love. In both All About Love and Love as the Practice of Freedom, Bell Hooks argues that all people have a right to be free, to live fully and well, and that grounding one's living in this stance constitutes a love ethic. And this commits to a societal shift from an individualistic, material-based culture to one of community and spirituality. Hooks joins the Black feminist scholarship about love as a politically transformative concept, contending that love confronts the way that fear ensures obedience in cultures of domination. A love ethic confronts this fear and holds the potential to create a culture of embracing the unknowns or the possibilities that can yield transformational living. Love is political. Love is radical. Love is revolutionary. As Bell Hooks writes, without love, our efforts to liberate ourselves and our world community from oppression and exploitation are doomed. As long as we refuse to address fully the place of love in struggles for liberation, we will not be able to create a culture of conversion where there is a mass turning away from an ethic of domination. So I'd like us to think a little bit more about this conception of love as we look at a few more images together. So I'm going to share my screen again. So here we see Jen Reed, that Clarence was talking about, standing on top of a plinth. And we recall Bell Hooks' definition that love is a practice of freedom. And she has her fist. This is a gesture of love and solidarity. So this is radical imagination and liberatory love. Here we see radical love, solidarity, and we have the LGBTQ plus colors illuminated on the plinth, which grounds us in reminding of us the intersectionality of Black Lives Matter. It is grounded in the LGBTQ community of color, very grounded in bringing the margins into the center of the fight. And sustaining the activism of this moment, we argue, is also intersectionality, which we haven't written about yet. That's where we're going next in our paper. This is a new epoch, we can argue, or to recall Langston Hughes' poem, The Day Has Come, telling history differently, making history differently. And it's worth recalling Angela Davis's quote, "This is an extraordinary moment. It is a pivotal moment, a moment of possibility. But let's be clear. It does not mean that we are necessarily offered a new future. What we are offered, rather, is the possibility of reimagining the future." And here we see an image of love, remembering that love is a verb, it is a practice, and we want us to think about the generative dimensions of love and highlight its fluidity. And although we certainly do not argue that feeling love or the concept of love is at the forefront for protesters necessarily when they are toppling the Confederate statues, we do contend that the act of toppling is an act of radical love, and that loving fiercely in relationship with others is a form of caring for the collective. It's centering community consciousness. This is a powerful image, I think. We can take a look at how she's standing. She's standing fairly upright. She's wearing a sundress, right? We can notice that her skin is exposed as opposed to the officers that are heavily garbed in their equipment. Even on her feet, she has like just step-in shoes. They're almost sandal-like. And she is meeting them head held up high. And so we think that this is an example, a depiction of what bell hooks talked about as a love ethic, grounding oneself in the right to be free, to live fully and well, and also the confrontation of fear, creating a culture, as she said, of conversion. And finally, we have two images here that we think help illustrate the definition of anti-racist critical public pedagogy, and also that encapsulates the three elements of culture of praxis, racial honesty, and radical imagination and love. Because anti-racist critical public pedagogies leverage a collective voice as collective power in public spaces and places to affect socio-political change, and particularly with regards to race. So let's unpack what we're seeing. Both of these are Christopher Columbus. The one on the left is in Miami. The one on the right is in Detroit. On the left, we see the red paint, right? The blood on his hands. We see the fierceness of the protester painting in broad daylight. And the action of this image invites the viewer to engage with the painting, to join the symbolic critique of the colonizing grand narrative around Christopher Columbus. This image on the left is one of re-envisioning. On the right, we see that the protesters are posing for the viewer, which communicates that this is a deliberate retelling of history. They came dressed to tell a story. They are taking authorship of the story that they are embodying. And the regency of this image tells of a rich cultural history. This is a counter-narrative, a story of resistance, of celebration, and a centering of marginalized history. The counter-narrative is communal. This image on the right, we think, is one of radical reimagining because it re-envisions, but it also offers an alternative vision and imagining. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Clarence.
Okay, so we'd like to conclude by returning to the beginning of the talk when Lisa read the names of those who died by state violence, and then read a verse from Langston Hughes' poem, Kids Who Died. We have an ethical responsibility to respond to that list, to those names. So I'd like to respond first of all by reading the last stanza of Hughes' poem. But the day will come, you are sure yourselves that it is coming, when the marching feet of the masses will raise for you a living monument of love and joy and laughter, and black hands and white hands clasped as one, and a song that reaches the sky, the song of a life triumphant through the kids who die. We'd like to conclude with the invitation Lisa gave us at the beginning of the talk. So we invite you for the duration of our remaining time to have engaged discussion as we share our diverse perspectives and recall our positionality, to conversations around the issue raised in anti-racist public pedagogies, and to reimaginings of transformational ways of living together. You may have questions for us, but we also have a question for you. What do you think can sustain the activism of this moment? Thank you for your attention and your time.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa and Clarence, for a very stimulating and moving presentation. In the spirit of Clarence's remarks and Lisa's earlier on, and in loving the questions, we would welcome it if you would now please turn on your own video so that we can look at one another as much as is possible on Zoom. Please do that if you're willing to do so. If it causes problems with the sound, we'll deal with that when the time comes. So our usual practice then is for people to post questions in the chat, and I invite you to do that, please. But while we're waiting for that to happen, I'd like to raise a question myself, picking up on something that Clarence said. Clarence, when you were talking about the Rob D. Lee statue, I think you talked about the action of the protesters as a form of creative destruction. And then you slightly altered the phrasing and said a destruction of the power of the image. Now, it seems to me that there is a very powerful destruction of the power of the image in the protest with Breonna Taylor's face on that monument. There wasn't a destruction of the monument itself. It's still standing, right? And I'd actually like to know a little bit about the actions of police in relation to this, but my more philosophical question is whether this is distinct, is different in this respect from what happened in Bristol, where there was more literally a destruction of the sculpture and it's being thrown into the sea, into the river.
Yeah, I like that. I think yes and no. I think there's similarities and there are obvious differences. So I think the Bristol statue, even though it was bigger, it was larger than life. It was accessible physically for people to climb and take the statue down and drag him into the harbor. Whereas my understanding, the Lee statue is so large that they would have had to use bulldozers or backhoes or whatever, fire truck ladders to get up there to remove it. So it would have taken more than just go home and get some ropes and let's pull this thing down kind of thing. So the physical would have to be done through more, what's the right word? More official means. But having said that, what we didn't show you, we just told you a story of one statue on the Monument Avenue. There are examples of Jackson, another commander on Monument Avenue, was toppled, and there's other monuments on the Monument Avenue. And now there's a discussion about what needs to be done in Richmond by the city itself with Monument Avenue. Like you can imagine, the slave economy during the pre-Civil War was the economic driver. Well, Monument Avenue is a huge moneymaker for Richmond, Virginia at the moment, right? People come there and tourists. So what does Richmond do? But in the meantime, the power of that image or the power of the monument is nevertheless damaged. They can scrub off maybe the paint off the plinth, but in a sense, the innocence of protection has gone, is disappeared. And I think that is part of the destruction, even if the physical destruction hasn't happened. There's been a disruption of the power, I think, and a loss of innocence, if there ever was an innocence.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we've got questions coming in, and Alison, would you like to start off? Alison's just noted that her sound's gone a bit shaky. But we'll hold on to this. Video's on for the time being, unless many people complain. Alison.
Yeah, I mean, it might just be the internet, so just let me know if I'm kind of speaking.
This is very hard to hear.
Connecting or whatever.
Can I just, Alison, just a minute, can I just check? I can hardly hear this at all.
But yeah, I just had a question about right, okay. I don't know if it's
Alison, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Could you try turning off your video, please, and just phrase your question? Thank you.
I can hear you.
Good. No, just speak now. Try speaking.
So it might just be me. Yeah, is that a bit better?
Yes.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
when you say that, yes. Try again.
Okay, I'll just ask that, but yeah, no, I was just wondering whether you think the census
Okay, Alison, will you stop, please? Because I think I'm not alone in that I can only hear a garbled noise now. So I'm going to read your question then. Clarence and Lisa, how much, Alison asks, how much do you think the dissensus is a vital element of reimagining? And is this in some sense paradoxical, perhaps, when it comes to thinking about collectivism and community? So Clarence and Lisa, would you like to respond, please?
So it's what's interesting, Lisa and I, in a previous paper or previous presentation, actually, we used the idea of dissensus, or we thought about the idea of dissensus in conjunction with images, actually. And I think that dissensus doesn't have to be individual, it can be collective, I think. And I do think that, so dissensus more or less is the idea of a disruption, something external disrupts sort of the coherence of the picture that you have, or the coherence of the view that you have, right? So it's an external force, external something, an external sensibility that interrupts your flow of thinking and your flow of seeing and interpreting. So I do think that that dissensus is a vital element in the reimagining that's going on here, right? So we can look at, we didn't think about using the term dissensus, but you can look at if you think of the Colston example, it's clearly, I mean, there's a number of places where you can say, well, drowning him in the drowning his stone statue, like giving him retelling the ending of his story, that he should have been drowned in the harbor. That's dissensus. That's jarring our sensibilities, right? Having that ring of slaves lying at the foot of his plinth. So those are really elements of disturbance that make you sit up and take notice. That it calls you up short, as Gadamer might say. I don't know, Lisa, you want to add anything to that?
I muted myself just because I thought maybe that would help. No, I think that covers it, and I would agree, absolutely, a part of it, right? The spaces of new possibilities, then the disruption, right, is the fractioning for openings. Definitely an important piece of reimagining, re-envisioning as well, but more so reimagining.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa and Clarence. Rowena, you have a question. Turn on your microphone, please.
Thank you. I'll just read what I wrote. So thank you for the talk and the powerful images that both of you shared. And as I write here, I'm inspired by your hope about the moment. At the same time, European imperialism and its aftermath is 500 years old. So I'm struck by how white supremacy is embedded so deeply into institutional structures, not just in the West, but across the entire world, including the global South. So I suppose my question is, may I know what you think is different or special about this moment, and perhaps how it compares in importance with other important moments in history, like the global wave of decolonization in the middle of the 20th century and the US civil rights movement?
I think one of the things that's really different about this moment is who's listening, who's paying attention, and who's participating. Right, so these are not new arguments, as we said, and these are not new fights or dilemmas, but this is a large number of white people that are now joining in, and we see some similarities to the civil rights movement, where we have cross-racial collaboration, so much youth involved, and Clarence and I have talked a lot about the intersectionality of this moment. Seems to be something that also is shaping this moment a bit differently. Clarence, you want to build on that from
Yeah,
some
so I was glad you mentioned the intersection of